Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of the most important events in history, the American Revolution. This was the time when the 13 colonies in North America rose up against British rule and ultimately gave birth to what we now know as the United States. It all started as a protest against taxes but quickly escalated into a full-blown rebellion, fueled by ideas of freedom and independence. Let's rewind back to the 1760s. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, which meant they were now in control of a huge chunk of North America. But the war left them with a massive debt. To pay this off, the British government decided to tax the American colonies. The problem? The colonies didn't have a say in this. Up until then, the British pretty much left the colonies to govern themselves, and they were used to doing things their own way. The colonists saw themselves as British citizens, with the same rights as people back in England. One of the big things they believed in was no taxation without representation. Since the American colonies didn't have representatives in the British Parliament, they felt it was completely unfair to be taxed by them. This all came to a head in 1763 when King George III issued the Royal Proclamation, which said that colonists couldn't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered a lot of people, especially those who had fought in the recent war, expecting to get new land, or those in Virginia hoping to expand westward. This was just the beginning. Things really started heating up when Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764. This was a tax on molasses, something that was a big deal in New England, and colonists saw it as an unnecessary interference. But the real kicker came in 1765 with the Stamp Act, which taxed all sorts of paper goods like newspapers, playing cards, and legal documents. This was the first direct tax on the colonies, and it sparked outrage across America. Protests erupted. In Massachusetts, leaders like Samuel Adams and James Otis argued that this violated their rights. In Virginia, Patrick Henry made bold speeches, saying only Virginians had the right to tax Virginians. And in Boston, things got chaotic. The Sons of Liberty, a group of political activists, led riots and attacked officials' homes. Protests like these popped up in other colonies too. The colonies came together for the first time in what was called the Stamp Act Congress. They decided to resist these British taxes as one. Shocked by the backlash, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but not without passing the Declaratory Act, reminding the colonies that Britain still had the right to make laws for them in all cases. But Britain wasn't done. Next, they passed the Townshend Acts, which taxed things like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, the colonies pushed back hard. Merchants boycotted British goods, and the Sons of Liberty made sure loyalists, or Tories, felt their wrath, sometimes through violent means like tarring and feathering. In 1768, things took a turn when the British seized John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, accusing him of smuggling. This sparked a riot in Boston, and when word of the unrest reached Britain, they sent troops to restore order. The soldiers set up camp in Boston, and tensions only grew worse. Finally, in March 1770, things boiled over into the infamous Boston Massacre. British soldiers, under attack from an angry crowd, fired into the mob, killing 5 colonists. Although most of the soldiers were acquitted, the Patriots used this event as powerful propaganda to fuel the anti-British sentiment. So, after the Boston Massacre, things calmed down a bit. In fact, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend Acts, except for one sneaky little tax on tea. Now, for a while, it seemed like things might go back to normal. But then in 1773, the British decided to pass the Tea Act. This seemed harmless on the surface, but what it really did was give the British East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies, and, of course, that tea was still taxed. To the Patriots, this was just a tricky way to get them to pay the tax and admit that Parliament had control over them. This led to one of the most famous protests in American history, the Boston Tea Party. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. Parliament wasn't about to let this slide. In retaliation, they passed the Coercive Acts in 1774, which the colonists started calling the Intolerable Acts because, well, they were pretty harsh. These acts shut down Boston Harbor, suspended Massachusetts' government, and even allowed British soldiers to be housed in colonists' buildings without permission. This was the final straw for many colonists. In response, every colony except Georgia sent representatives to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774. They weren't ready to break away from Britain just yet, but they were getting close. The Congress sent a petition to King George III, hoping he would step in and help, blaming all the problems on Parliament. They also started boycotting British goods again and quietly prepared for possible military conflict. Meanwhile, things were heating up in New England. Local militias started training and stockpiling weapons, preparing for a showdown. The British knew this, and on April 19, 1775, a group of British soldiers marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize a stockpile of weapons. But they were met by a small group of American militiamen in Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. 8 militiamen were killed, and the British moved on to Concord, where they met a much larger group of militiamen. The British were forced to retreat, and by the time they made it back to Boston, thousands of militiamen were surrounding the city. Just like that, the American Revolutionary War had officially begun. With the war in full swing, the Second Continental Congress met again in May 1775 to take control of the rebellion. They created the Continental Army and named George Washington as its commander. Still trying to avoid a full break with Britain, they sent one last plea to King George, called the Olive Branch Petition. But the king didn't even bother to read it. Instead, in October 1775, he declared that the colonies were in open rebellion. This shocked many Americans who had still hoped for a peaceful solution. That's when Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense hit the colonies like a lightning bolt. Paine argued that it was time for the colonies to declare independence from Britain. His arguments were simple and easy to understand, and they resonated with people all across the colonies. Suddenly, the idea of independence was on the table. By July 1776, the Continental Congress had made up its mind. On July 2nd, they voted for independence, and on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. This bold move officially turned the colonies into the United States of America. But while the political shift was monumental, the war was far from over. Early on, the Americans had some military successes, like the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and the siege of Boston. But things took a dark turn when the British captured New York City and chased George Washington's army through New York and New Jersey. By the end of 1776, Washington's army had dwindled to just a few thousand men. It looked like the revolution might collapse. Then, in a daring move, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and scored a surprise victory at the Battle of Trenton. A week later, he won again at the Battle of Princeton. These victories lifted spirits and kept the revolution alive. However, 1777 was a tough year. Washington's army suffered defeats at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, and the British captured Philadelphia, forcing Congress to flee. But just when things seemed bleak, the Patriots secured a game-changing victory at the battles of Saratoga. This was huge. It convinced France to join the war on the American side. With French money, troops, and ships now in the mix, the tide began to turn in favor of the Americans. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, where they faced hunger, cold, and disease. But by the time they left, the army was tougher, more disciplined, and ready to take on the British. In 1778, the Continental Army held its own in the Battle of Monmouth, proving that they could stand toe-to-toe with British forces. The focus of the war then shifted to the South, where the British won several key battles. But the American forces, under leaders like Nathanael Greene, used hit-and-run tactics and wore the British down. By 1781, British General Cornwallis found himself trapped by American and French forces at Yorktown, Virginia. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered to Washington, effectively ending the war. Finally, in September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the United States was officially recognized as an independent nation. And that, folks, is how the American Revolution went from a tax protest to the birth of a brand new country.